to Badaboom. On this episode, Mark Russell returns. Russell, who first appeared on the podcast to talk about Superman Space Age, is back to discuss its spiritual successor, Batman Dark Age. Russell shares what it's like to collaborate with Mike and Laura Allred again and how this story differs from their Superman. Listen in and bada boom. Hey Mark, how you been?
Good, good.
Good, good. I'm excited. First time we ever talked, we got to talk about a little book called Superman Space Age. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you again because now we're talking about Superman Dark Age. So what's it been like sort of at this point, sort of to work with Mike and Laura again, and also DC to kind of expand some of the stuff you guys touched on with Superman Space Age?
Well, working with the Allreds first is like a true. They're not just incredible artists, but really good friends at this point. So I love whenever to work with them. But yeah, I'm very sort of happy with how Superman Space Age was received by the public and also by DC. The fact they're letting us get away with it a second time is amazing to me.
Yeah. And it kind of seems like it's almost like a spiritual successor. It's not really like a sequel, just because if you've read Superman Space Age, there is some Batman in that. So in terms of this story, sort of what were sort of like the goals, or was it something that DC came to you guys with, or it's something that you pitched them on?
It's something we pitched them on, but it felt like a natural next step in the progression of the story because premise is that this is another universe like the one in Superman Space Age that is doomed, that the Anti-Monitor is going to destroy, but it's seen through Batman's vantage point, and it's about him like trying to save Gotham, knowing that that nobody is willing to help him because everyone's focused on trying to save the universe. Batman's credo is basically that justice is local. That you start by seeing people around you and move out from there. So it's sort of not only about him and his life and how he became sort of the Dark Knight of Gotham, but also about sort of the tension between him and the philosophy of Superman and how he's different than the other members of the Justice League.
Yeah, and again, we saw some of that in Space Age, especially with some of those discussions between Superman and Batman. Those are some of my favorite parts in terms of like their philosophies and how they approach things in terms of like being a hero. And you saw sort of Batman kind of peel away from the Justice League, and sort of as the world is kind of coming apart, he's handling this Joker threat in Gotham. So also like when it comes to working with Mike and Laura Allred, like what's it been like sort of shifting? Because I think Superman is a very different type of hero. Metropolis is a different type of city. So what's it been like sort of getting those pages back and sort of talking like what's a collaboration like? Is it something more like you're writing really detailed scripts, or are you giving them sort of the freedom to explore?
Well, one thing I learned from Superman Space Age is that the more freedom you can give Mike Allred, better off you are. So I'm writing much looser scripts, focusing more on what I want to say in the dialogue, in the captions, and leaving more and more of the art direction to Mike. So I try to like cram as few panels as possible into a page with the idea that like any one of these panels could turn into a splash page if Mike really wants to draw. And so the other panels need some place to go. So, but that's part of the fun. It's like I don't really know until I get pages back from what he's actually going to do with the script I gave him. So when I get him and I see like, oh wow, he chose to really focus on this and it looks amazing. To me, that's like sort of the right point of my week. That's where
Yeah.
what convinces me word.
Yeah, and some of the previews that have come out are pretty amazing. Like there's that big page of actually just Bruce in his room reading. I think sort of it just speaks to like what Mike is able to convey. Because something I'm sure you wrote very simply, this beautiful page that has so many emotional meaning with the posters in the background and stuff like that. So, and I think that's something that Space Age was really great about. And I think for me in comics, like what I love about like what Mike does is like when I read, any book that he's on art, it's almost feels like I'm transported to a different world. Like I'm like in
Yeah.
wherever it is. And I think it sort of shows the power of like what comics is able to do.
Yeah, and I think he's sort of the perfect artist for doing a sort of alternate universe like this because his art itself looks like a comic book in an alternate universe. It looks like something that's unique and unmistakable with anybody else's art. So it's like for the moment you see a Mike Allred page, you know that this is going to be a different journey than the other comics you've read before.
Yeah. And in terms of like sort of tackling the Batman aspect of it, was it something that like where you wanted to expand on what was said in Space Age, or was there something that like a Batman story you kind of always had in the back of your mind where you're like, I think I really have something to say with this character?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to Space Age in that I wanted to tell the story of Batman against the backdrop of recognizable human history.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell like what would Batman be going through in the 60s, 70s? What would Bruce Wayne? How would he interact with the world of that era? And so it is very much like Space Age in that sense, but it's a very different story than Space Age because Batman's trajectory is so much different than Superman's. Superman came, his world was obliterated and he came from nothing, but found a family and friends who loved him and, made him, really sort of built his outlook on life. Whereas Bruce Wayne's kind of the exact opposite. He started with a family who loved him, this great sort of life, and that was all taken from him by the assassination of his parents. And so now he's set on a trajectory of dark justice.
No, and I think Batman's a very interesting character, and Superman is very similar too. Where like as much as like we all say like, "Hey, I've seen his parents die enough," we all sort of like are fascinated with that story, and it's really a classic American story where there's so many ways you could kind of add layers to it, and I'm really excited to see your take on it because sort of what you're able to do with Superman Space Age was something where for me genuinely it was my favorite Superman story, and I think it's mainly because the way it kind of caught me, and we kind of talked about this before we got on, but as a parent it kind of hit me really hard where you feel like some things like and Superman's dealing with that in Space Age where the world around them is crumbling. He has this
Yeah,
family and he's doing his best to be Superman, optimistic and save the world. So I'm really excited to see what the book is because I think Batman's one of those characters that could carry the burden of multiple iterations.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like what's sort of fascinating about retelling these stories, even though they've been sort of mythologized and retold so many times already, is it gives you a chance to sort of approach these figures not as heroes but as human beings. They're all sort of sons, fathers, wives, daughters. What are how is it that their human relationships make them into these otherworldly superhuman figures?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of the ultimate sort of thought experiment of like superheroes is like what would you know what would happen to you, or what sort of life would you have if this had happened to you, or what would you do if life had dealt you this set of cards?
And for you, was there a particular like? I mean, obviously this it spins off of Space Age, but was there a Batman story that really affected you and kind of inspired you in terms of like giving you the fuel to kind of tell this story?
I tried to not be too influenced by any of the Batman stories. I've read a lot of really great Batman stories, and I think that ultimately the influence that both Superman Space Age and this one share in common is Crisis on Infinite Earths. But I try to like write these stories as much in a bubble as possible. It's like I don't want it to be too reflective of things that have gone on, which I think really helps when you set it in like an alternate universe where this universe is sort of a one-off that sort of gets destroyed.
Another thing I really love about your work is just as a reader, I'm really able to engage with it, almost feel like I'm having a conversation. And, I think that's something you've done well, like especially in your work recently with like Rumpus Room traveling to Mars. So in terms of like, and I've asked you like this before, but what's it like to sort of be able to kind of have that freedom to be able to engage with your audience like that, kind of be able to tell these stories that are sort of very timely, but also kind of have the typical like sort of like entertainment factor of something like Rumpus Room, where you have that humor, or Space Age, where you have that amazing Mike and Laura Allred art that's with the Justice League and all that. So, what's that like to kind of be able to have that platform?
It's wonderful, I mean, it's so as a writer, you perform in isolation. It's not like you're in a band, or it's not like you're singing or acting on stage. You have no idea how people are reacting to what you're doing. So months, sometimes years after you've actually written it. So it is really wonderful to see how these comics are received, when they come out, and the sort of reactions. Superman Space Age got, and the reactions comics getting so far from those who've seen it. It's really humbling, and also just reminds me that you're not alone. You think you're the only one who maybe enjoys these types of stories or believes in these sorts of things you're saying through the characters, but you're really not. There's a lot of other people out there that share this experience with you, and it makes me feel part of the human race, which is difficult sometimes as a writer.
No, no, of course. And something you have coming up that I'm excited about just because of like Rumpus Room, you have Death Ratio, that one shot coming through AWA. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So death ratio is about a future where the where social media basically is replaced again, where there's no real police or legal system anymore. Everyone just has an exploding necklace, and if you get too many, if you get a bad enough ratio, or you get too many dislikes, it explodes and kills you. It's not everyone's sort of best interest to sort of behave and be nice, and but it really is sort of a metaphor for the dangers of buying into sort of the mass consciousness that is social media. About how social media, whether you're using it for good or bad, whether or not you are a troll or a well-meaning participant, you are ultimately sort of participating in this mass consciousness where you're trying to couch what you're saying or gauge how its reaction. It's ultimately the reactions that's sort of driving your opinion, not the other way around.
Yeah, and I think especially with social media and sort of like the way it's evolved, especially more recently, you have these algorithms that amplify certain types of content and voices. So you do see that, like, even having the podcast and sort of like seeing like what works in terms of getting out, you see sort of like
Yeah,
how certain things get put to the top, and then some of the things that you're like, oh, like I really worked hard on this, or I really want people to kind of enjoy it. You're like, well, that's all the way at the bottom.
turns this into Pavlovian dogs. It's like we are, whether we realize it or not, we're following the incentives that are laid out for us by the likes, and ultimately, we're not shaping the algorithm so much as the algorithm is shaping us and our behaviors, which I think is the real danger of social media, is that it's potentially become this sort of mediocrity engine.
I know, like, seeing people that I used to know on Facebook and just seeing how they have psychotic breaks because of social media.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. Especially again, some people you think you knew, or just kind of the way it affects people. And I see kind of like the way it's even affected me in terms of like my attention span for certain things. I mean,
oh yeah.
granted, like now I'm a dad, so like I think sometimes like last time I got to binge something was when I had COVID like 2 years ago, and I like quarantined at my mom's house, and I watched like midnight mass in one sitting, and I was like, man, I miss this. But I think it is something very interesting, and it kind of ties into sort of a lot of the stuff that you talk about in your writing, whether it be like Rumpus Room, where you have, sort of talking about like the billionaire class and sort of how that affects us, and how it almost feels like, we're hamsters on a wheel.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly it. We are following, you know, trails of incentives that we don't even ourselves understand. And I think that's what happens to some of these people that fall down these rabbit holes. It's like it's not a true reflection of who they are or their beliefs so much as they found approval in these communities, or they fall asked a question on like one of these pages, and they got like all of a sudden a bunch of likes and new friends, and they just sort of follow these acorns down to a very nasty tree.
Yeah. And there's also a lack of accountability from some of these companies. So whereas,
Oh
like
yeah,
you see something like that happen to Fox News, where, they have the domino lawsuit, and that kind of like cripples the entire company. But, something like a Facebook or TikTok, which can be actually more harmful just because of the way it's kind of able to bombard you with like certain algorithms, it's not able
right.
to be held accountable in any way just because of the nature
Yeah,
of our
one
laws.
of the exactly one of the scariest things about the 21st century is there appear to be very few consequences for disinformation, for lying to people, and also with social media, and I think with things like Chat GPT and the sort of AI revolution will do, allow people to sort of industrialize disinformation. So you could be on a page and there could be 500 other posters and 499 of them could be AI generated. Yeah, except for you. And they're all saying one thing. And it becomes like the conformity experiment, where if you have one actual person and four plants, and the other four plants are saying the obviously shorter line is longer than the other line, you're tempted to go along with them because you don't want to seem stupid. You don't want to feel like an outlier. And I think that's the real danger of not only social media, but AI generated reality.
Yeah, and it seems like we're getting closer to those things. But like I said, it's great to have a writer like you in comics to kind of be able to engage in those type of those topics, and I think it really highlights how comics are able to have that discussion and in a really fun and engaging way.
I think that this is really what you should be doing with comics because it's cheaper to make a comic book than it is to make a movie or a TV show. You should be taking some chances. You should be talking about the things they're not talking about in TV or movies, or things that like are maybe a little edgier than what you would say about them in like a TV show or a movie that's beholden to a focus group or an executive who's spending $20 million on your project.
Yeah, and which is probably going to be on a streamer that has investments in some of
Yeah,
these topics that you
right.
want to talk about. So I think it's and also too, I think you're able to just be more timely with some of these discussions. I think especially when it comes to movies or a TV series, a lot of times they take years to produce, and by the time if you're doing something like a certain topic, it might be out of the news by the time it comes out, or the discussion around it has completely shifted.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that you can really be sort of the first to punch in comics where it's like something big happens that changes everything. You're right. It's going to take probably a year or two for movies to be able to talk about it. But in a comic book, you can talk about it within a matter of weeks. And so, in a lot of ways, it becomes sort of the first visual medium to uh, to address something that just happened, to sort of help digest what we're going through as we're going through it.
Yeah. And before I let you go, I just wanted to sort of give you the platform to be able to talk about what you have next. Obviously, from when we're recording this, Batman Dark Age comes out next week. We know you have that AWA one shot coming up, but is there anything else that you have in the works coming?
Yeah, there's something that I'm very proud of that I want to put on everybody's radar, and that's the collected um, book for Traveling to Mars, which I think may be the best series I've ever written. Is coming out in May. The initial final order cutoff is April 8th. So please tell your local comic shop to order you a copy of Traveling to Mars, the trade paperback coming out in May.
Yeah, I really hope they do a hardcover like DC
Yeah,
did
me
with the
too.
Superman Space Age.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, especially I think is it 11 issues or 12?
11.
11. Yeah, I think that would definitely collect well on a hardcover.
Oh, I was just saying, it'll be a thick volume. You won't have wasted your money. It'll be something you will be proud to put on the bookshelf.
No, no, and for sure. And if you're a fan of Mark's work like I am, I think you're gonna love it. Thanks again for coming on, Mark. It's always a pleasure. Again, I really love anytime I see a book of yours coming out. It's one of those things I definitely have to grab, especially since Superman Space Age. That's definitely made me fall in love with your work, and now I'm a
Oh,
lifelong
thank you.
fan. So I appreciate
Thank you
that.
so much.
And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom.
Thank you for listening to the Badaboom podcast. Keep the conversation going with Chris and I on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. You can find us on all these places at Badaboom Podcast. Get into the comments on our YouTube channel. Let us know what you like about the show or what you'd like to hear from us in the future. Until next time, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thanks for listening.